to play the trumpet. I was schooled and I started my music education in Soweto. And due to the lack of resources, for example, there were too many people who wanted to play the saxophone. So sometimes it ended up like that one person would take the saxophone this week and then some other person would take the saxophone next week. So it was always that problem. We were under-resourced. And the only instrument that was available that I could have to myself was the trumpet, and it was in my teacher's boot. So that's how I actually started playing it. And from then I thought, this thing is just has like three buttons, you know. I'd play it in like 3 weeks and I'd master it in like 4 months, and I'll be like, great. And then I can move on to the instrument that I really want, the saxophone. So it proved to be the one, you know. I think I'm not saying that I'm finding my voice. It's a very good teacher for me. So it chose me in a very strange kind of way. I didn't choose it. I mean, brass instruments, for example, those are instruments that are readily available. For example, trombones, saxophones. Those are instruments that are much more cheaper, as opposed to actually playing a French horn, for example, or playing oboe, or predominantly in the black community in South Africa. And obviously there are exceptions to that, a lot of exceptions to that. And then like instruments like bassoon, or more cumbersome instruments like the tuba. So we also have to think about transportation. How do you get around? Like I have not met a lot of black harpists, for example. It's also the proximity and where we interact with those instruments. Obviously, like for example, there's the Salvation Army. So there's the Episcopal churches, Pentecostal churches, for example. There's also versions of the ZCC that have brass instruments. So it's also how those instruments come into contact with the communities as well. So it's basically mainly through the churches, marching bands, societies, schools, missionary schools. Back in the day, obviously, if you had to learn in the missionary education, you had to, and if you're doing music, you had to know tonic salvo, you had to play the piano, you had to know how to sing in the choir, for example. That's how also access to those kinds of instruments, where you also see a prevalence of maybe lots of piano players who come, or lots of jazz musicians who come from formerly mission bases, such as in the Eastern Cape, such as New Brighton. So the trumpet exists on partial systems. So just like you'd have a scale, which is 8 notes, it works on partials. So for example, one position can have multiple notes, for example. For example, so all these notes have partials, so they're separated by the distances. So the distance, the higher you go, the smaller they become. So in the lower octave, the intervals are much more greater. So and then as you go up, the intervals get smaller. So it's a mathematical system that works with the air pressure, and actually the valves are acting as a way to circumvent the air. So channeling the air, or having shortcuts, or making the pathway through the bell, through the instrument quicker. So essentially the trumpet is basically a vuvuzela. A vuvuzela, you know how a vuvuzela works, right? So it's just one pipe. So in the sense, it's shortened, and the valves facilitate with production of other notes. You might find when you try to play the vuvuzela, you can only get a maximum of 3, 4, or if you're really good at it, you can get 12 notes. So with the trumpet, that makes it easier. There was an earlier version of the trumpet called a bugle, which had no vowels. Now the trumpet comes in through its development, through the years, through the thousands of years. This is the modern trumpet, which has 3 vowels. So there are various roles that exist in a band or in an ensemble. So essentially, how I would look at it is that the bass is the anchor. It keeps everything down. So it would act as the rhythmic instrument in the band. It keeps, you know exactly where you are when you listen to the bass. So that's the instrument that you zone into when you listen to the jazz band. And that's actually more the instrument that guides you and tells you harmonically where is it happening. If you were not, let's say for example, if there was no pianist in the band, if there was no guitarist in the band, that would be the role of the bass. And the role of the drums in the band is also not just provide the groove, and not just provide the rhythm. It's also to provide the texture, also it's basically the carpet as an accompaniment as well, accompaniment to the soloist, accompaniment to the melody. And it depends what kind of context you also play. It depends also what kind of genre you're looking at. So it can have the predominant role of actually fulfilling just rhythm, and that's what it must do. But it can also have much more bigger or wider roles, such as the role of actually fulfilling in the accompaniment and also texture. And then you also have the instruments such as the trombone, for example, which would play the harmony part or would play the obbligato. Or an obbligato part is a part that plays around the melody. For example, a counter melody to what the general melody would be. And then you'd have the melody part, essentially that. For example, if I had to put it in a soccer situation, right? The bass player would be the goalkeeper, right? The drummer would be the defender, right? And then the trombone would be the midfielder and the trumpeter would be the striker, right? So that's how the musical ball passes around. So in that situation, you could also see it in a different way. So different people might also argue with me and they say that the drummer is the goalkeeper and the bass player is the defender and vice versa. So in Excel, that's the premise of the roles that are in the jazz band. But those roles can also be reversed. It's not a set. It's not a set. It's not a set kind of tradition. Partly because with jazz music, it's a different kind of music. For example, in that it requires investment, personal investment, in the sense that it's not easy. It's not a music that makes it easy for you to grasp. You need to commit to actually trying to understand. When you first listen to it, it's always above your head. But the more you listen to it, the more that you understand, and the more the music reveals itself with that. And also the people who listen, who are the people exposed to this kind of music, for example. You might find that the people who are exposed to this kind of music are maybe people who, and you might even find that people who went to multiracial school education might have had multiracial or whatever kind of education, might still not like jazz because of its aesthetics, or it's also not. It's very much a learned music. So it's not a watered down music. It's not something that is used to boost sales, and very much the music. Also, the music that we listen to is basically also deeply entrenched in our social patterns and our social interactions as people. So you might find jazz played a very pivotal role in the struggle because it was a galvanizing force. It was a popular music of that time, and its practitioners were doing very influential things. For example, like Umamiri Makeba, like Uprahu, and you might and a few other people of that movement who could persuade a vast amount of audiences through that music, and and it took on a different stance. It became protest music. We need to be our own agents of change. I mean, there needs to be meaningful collectivization of our efforts. For example, we need to own our own means of production. We need to own our own resources. We need to be the propagators of our own narratives. We need to start doing that. We need to be the own heroes of our own myths. We need to create our own myths as well. In us doing that, we need to have our own mode. We need to distribute our own, find our own meaningful forms of distribution, meaningful forms of archival and of documentation, so that we set the agenda and that the agenda is not set for us. So we can also see creative interventions and creative ways of disruptions. I'm saying that jazz does not only belong in the bourgeois jazz clubs. Jazz music, or music in general, even classical music, even maskandi, even kwela, should be played everywhere.